A warm welcome to those of you who are just joining us now for this public event, which is entitled Assemble, and I'll come on to explain that in a few moments. I'm Sharath Srinivasan. I'm the co-director of the Centre of Governance and Human Rights and based in the Department of Politics and International Studies here. So a very warm welcome to you to Cambridge if you're coming from afar, but also to those who are just joining us now after our symposium that we've just had. Delighted you could join us. This is a real special occasion for us at the Centre, and we're very happy to have such a wonderful audience with us. So, as you will know, hopefully, one of the reasons that we're here this evening is to mark the launch of the Oxford Handbook of Peaceful Assembly. And I'm pointing to it because it looms there over my shoulder. So that's a volume that many of you in the room will know has taken years to bring into fruition, and that I'm also enormously proud of, as I think anyone who's been part of this journey is as well. It's 600 and more pages and 38 chapters, and has contributors that are drawn from law, from political theory, sociology, anthropology, history, many other disciplines, also spanning all continents that are at least inhabited. And it is also a volume that brings practitioners and those with a real hands-on experience of assembly in the world into its pages. And yet I want to say something that's quite odd for what is a book launch as such, as an event that's about a book, that we're not really here to talk about the book at all. So a handbook like this does its work on the page, in solitude over time, and we're grateful for those of you who have already engaged in it and told us that it was worth that time. What it cannot do, and what I think no book can do, is convene. It cannot generate the friction of disagreement and discussion, the urgency of the present moment, the electricity of people who have actually put their bodies, their consciences, and their will on the line, their careers as well, for the rights and the ideas that also fill its pages. And that's what this event, Assemble, is really all about. That said, I would be remiss not to note something rather remarkable about who is in this room. We have nearly, I think it's a bit of a stretch, but nearly half of the contributors to the handbook also assembled here today, including my three co-editors, Tabitha Abu-al-Hajj, Michael Hamilton, and who is here somewhere, and Thomas Probert, who have been wonderful colleagues through this journey. We also have a number of people who I think have engaged with the process over time in different ways, and really appreciative of that. The people who have wrote this book have in essence assembled around it, and that feels very much right. So let me just say a little bit about this event. Assembly and protest. Why does it matter? Look around the world right now. We are, almost by any measure, in a protest age, and simultaneously in an age of backlash against protest. The right to peaceful assembly is under pressure in democracies and authoritarian regimes alike, and as we've heard, perhaps that distinction is increasingly being blurred by the drift into a more authoritarian and predatory world. In the UK, Palestine Action protesters facing charges that test exactly where the line between legitimate dissent and criminalised disruption now runs. It's a line that is highly politicised, of course, all under the spectre of quote-unquote terrorism. At the very moment, that line is really being redrawn, and that's not just through that case, but also through a lot of the legislative work that's going on right now that we've heard about today. In the United States, ICE operations that have made showing up in public a risk calculation for entire communities. Protesters in Minnesota facing federal charges that would once have been unthinkable for nonviolent action. And yet, as we just also heard before, nevertheless, new forms of assembly and mobilization that really matter in visceral and real ways on the ground to the people facing this kind of coercion. And globally, a pattern that's documented and systematic of states learning from each other how to suppress assembly while maintaining the appearance of legality. And yet people keep assembling. They keep coming out. And we'll hear more on that line. In my own work in Sudan, just absolutely against all odds, I see assembly. In Chile, in France, in Georgia, but in many other places around the world, on campuses, in town squares, on blocks or half of blocks. Something keeps drawing people together, in public often, but not always, but to refuse, to demand, to imagine together. And that something is worth naming. When we talk about assembly under threat, the instinct is to reach for the language of rights, the right to protest, the right to gather, the right to be heard. Rights matter, and we'll hear about them tonight. But that framing also undersells what's actually at stake. Assembly is one of the oldest forms of political power, the capacity of people to come together, to act in concert, and to begin something that's genuinely new. What gets tamed when assembly is tamed is not just a right, it is that power. And its suppression is not incidental, it is the point. So I'd invite you as an audience, not as spectators, to hold that in mind throughout the evening. And to address the questions that animate this panel, we have four people who I can only describe as extraordinary, and I'm really delighted to have you all with us. So I'm going to introduce them in turn. First, Agnès Callamard, who's the Secretary General of Amnesty International, and before that, UN Special Rapporteur on Extrajudicial Killings, who led the investigation into the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi at considerable personal risk. Her career has moved between civil society, international institutions, and the academy, always in proximity to the people most exposed to state violence, someone who has stood in the way of states that would rather silence than answer. Gina Romero, welcome. Now I say a friend and colleague of the Centre and all of us here in Cambridge. A new friend, the current UN Special Rapporteur on the rights to freedom of peaceful assembly and association, a Colombian human rights activist who works with and against the law, as is required, and who came to this role from years working with social movements and communities across Latin America, people for whom assembly has not been an abstract entitlement, but also a condition of survival and reclaiming political community. The person whose job right now is literally to try to hold states to account and set standards and raise and expand the debate on how we think about the right to peaceful assembly that we're talking about here today. Martha Spurrier, who's a barrister, a human rights practitioner, occasional writer, former director of Liberty here in the UK, very much involved in some of the key work that's being done to defend the rights of protesters, and someone who's fought those battles both in the courtrooms but also on the streets and in the public sphere in this country. And we're really glad to have you here, Martha. And finally, Roger Hallam, who is the co-founder of Extinction Rebellion, Just Stop Oil, and most recently Assemble, the movement whose name, in a sense, we've borrowed for tonight, and we'll probably hear a bit about that, even if there might be some more heretical thoughts on the right to peaceful assembly, but that's exactly why we're here, so I look forward to that, Roger. A person who's not merely theorized about radical assembly, but also seeks to practice it very much right now, and also at considerable personal cost. So a word on how we'll run this evening, because I want to be clear, this will not be for four speakers followed by polite applause. We'll move through three thematic rounds of questions, beginning with why assembly and protest matter, personally and politically, moving to the assaults on those rights and how it's being resisted, and closing with something like a manifesto, a call to mostly peaceful arms, what each panelist believes needs to happen right now in the world that we're in. And in between, I'll open the floor for direct exchange among the panel, and we'll end with your questions. So I'll keep us moving. I will interrupt sometimes, perhaps redirect, but I hope that will make sure that we get to where we wish to go in the time that we have before we also bring you in as an audience. And the only rule, I hope, is that we'll stay close to what's real and what's really vitally important right now. So I want to start by just asking Agnès, maybe if you could kick us off, just like on your personal experience and where you're coming from, what has assembly meant to you in your work, and how do you think about where we are right now? And I know you've told some in the audience that quite recently, so a brief reprise of that for those who weren't in the room would be great.
Thank you very much. So maybe before I directly answer the question, I wanted to share three pictures. The one is in Cali, Colombia, where I met a mother and her daughter, who, in the context of a small assembly, were picked on by the police. They tried to drown the daughter. They raped the mother. And they are, when I met them a couple of years later, they were still petrified and lived in fear of what had been done to them and of the threats. That's one picture of assembly which I think we do need to understand, because yes, it is power, and that's why it's being repressed, often in the most violent way. The second image I want to share with you is that of this young Kenyan man. He's 19 years old, and I met him last month, and we were having, like now, a conversation around the Gen Z protest in Kenya, something he had done in the past on many occasions. There were 3 speakers, and he was asked a question around some of the repression he had witnessed, and for some reason, he just could not do it anymore. And he literally broke down in front of everybody, and in tears, shaking. A clear example of trauma and mental health weight that he had been carrying with him, and it was the first time, more than a year after the fact, that it came through. Of course, we stopped the conversation. I mean, there was, but it was a reminder to me of the deep cost that survivors carry with them. And then the third picture is that in Minneapolis, where I went last month, spent a few days with activists, although they will not describe them as activists. They describe themselves as normal people. Normal people meaning, a teacher, a nurse, a bank teller, who got so overwhelmed by what they were witnessing, they just could not do anything. And what the way they described to me what they were doing was, we're just here to protect our neighbors. And they get organized at the street level, at 3 to 5 neighbors coming together in the evening, preparing whistles, preparing little bags that they're going to distribute, and just spending several hours a day, and if they have more time, they do it for longer, on the street, watching out for ICE coming. And we know this, and picture Mrs. Smith. I mean, the most average person you can, 40-year-old, a mother, and picture her on the street whistling after when ICE shows up. And remember that 2 of those people died doing that. They come together, they make, they hold hands around a school to stop ICE from coming in. This is people's power at its most basic, because these are not, and I mean, you are a born activist. These were not people like that. They were your average middle class, just saying it cannot be happening to my neighborhood. And that's what they did. They came together, they did extraordinary things. The demonstration that everyone can become a hero. that everyone can do something for their neighbors. That is the third image I want to share with you. In this last one, they protect their neighbors, they push back against the Robocops called ICE at a high cost, and they ensure that humanity is preserved in American cities against the predator called Donald Trump. In the second, at a very big cost, this young man and thousands of other Gen Z push back against a very unfair taxation imposed on the poorest people in Kenya. And in the first one, it is a story to be written still, because fear is so high. But I think that's why assembly matters. That's why protest matters for big things, such as toppling a government in Nepal, and for smaller things but so meaningful, which is to protect your immediate neighbor and the children from being captured by a force operating supposedly within the law but outside the value and the principle of the law. That's why we need to fight for the protection of the right and of the power.
Great. And Gina, I might bring you in here. I mean, obviously also with your activist background, but also with what you're seeing as UN Special Rapporteur. I think we're starting a bit global, and then we might come to the UK with Martha and Roger in particular. But please tell us from your personal experience, and also, what you're seeing, what exercises you about assembly right now in the world.
Yeah, from the personal experience, I am a Colombian who grew up in the middle of a conflict. And I believe that at that point, and for many years, people didn't want to gather, because that was not only seen as suspicious, but also it was dangerous. And then just growing up with a generation that was completely fed up of the conflict and just tried to actually do some different actions to actually just put again back into society the need to gather and to act collectively. That is just a huge part of what I was when I was a young leader. But also my brother was killed by the state violence, and then for me also being able to protest is part of all the memory that we all victims of the conflict in Colombia have. And it was one of the things that actually put me in the streets first, but then also allow me to understand how important it is. Protest in specific and assemblies in general to actually look for a different future for ourselves, but also for the next generations. And then regarding why it matters today, I think that it has been there have been plenty of examples today, but then at the end, assemblies and then associations, which is the other part of my mandate, are fundamental for the collective action, which is at the root of democracy, of rule of law, but also on how we live together as humans. And that is also very important. Assemblies also help us to actually break the isolation and the disconnection that we all live in, because we live in a system, in an economic system that don't want us to be together, but also we are living in a dictator of algorithms and of technology that also wants us to isolate ourselves. So this is important. This is why assemblies in general is important, just to create human connections. And then the only thing that can save humanity and then ensure humanity in the future is that we keep these connections, that we learn how to live together, how to act together, how to come together and talk about the different issues, and then how to care about each other, and how to actually love each other in that sense of a context in which we are constantly bombard of all the bad things that happen and all the hate that we have around. But then just going more in the political level, assemblies are important to claim for our rights, to challenge the authorities, and then even the bad decisions like the ones that Agnès was talking about in Kenya, to speak truth to the power, to actually foster transformation and even bigger revolutions that actually are the only ones who have been able to bring us in a different level of an increase of the learning of societies is only by assemblies, like peaceful assemblies, another type of assemblies. But at the end, it is how we enjoy our time in this moment of life and in this earth is just actually by coming together. And this is the only way I can explain how important assemblies are.
Thank you, Gina. I mean, I think it's expansive both in terms of the global perspective, but also in taking us from the sort of the wide societal meaning, but then also the particular political moments where it really matters to change and bringing about change. I want to bring us to the UK and ask Martha and then Roger to come in to give us a sense from your perspective and your work as well with Liberty, Martha, maybe, but also beyond that. What does it mean for you, and where are we at?
Yeah, I mean, sorry, my voice is really failing me from my hay fever. I think, to pick up on this idea of love before we get into, being the lawyers and activists that we are and the academics, for me, on a very personal level, protest is important, and it's important enough that every time there's a protest, I take my 3 young children, because it is one of the few places now in a very online world and a very atomized world where you really feel community. And the kinds of protests that we go on, it's not just one community, it is a genuinely intersectional community, to use a horrible jargony word. But when we marched against the far right a month ago, I could have conversations with my kids about what the XR flag was and about flags that said trans women are women and Free Palestine and Black Lives Matter. And we could also march past the counter-protest of Zionists who are in favour of what is happening in Gaza. And we could walk right up to the line, and I could talk to my 3-year-old, 5-year-old and 7-year-old about what those people believe, what the police are there supposedly to do, we'll come back to that, and why we were turning out on our own behalf, and who else we were standing in solidarity with, and who we were there on behalf of, because there were some people who probably were not able to be there for all kinds of reasons. And so, sure, it's my work, and we can, talk about the work we did at Liberty on legislation, on the many successful attempts to restrict and attack the right to protest in the UK. I also am doing international cases. All of that matters and is important. But if the question is, why does it matter personally? It is because it is one of the rare moments when I feel that I am part of something that is hopeful, that has the capacity to be powerful, that understands building coalitions through difference, and that understands belonging in a way that is not the belonging that will be shouted about in London this weekend by tens of thousands of people. And as you said, Sharath, it is the place of a birth of a new kind of power, and it is very often met with an old kind of power, right from politicians and the police, and also then to the law itself. And just to be clear, I think, about the context that we now find ourselves in, it is not only that the attacks on protest are acute and relentless, whether through legislation or through policing on the streets or through the court's response to the legislation and the policing, but it is also that it is uneven in the way that it is done, because that is how it has always been, because you cannot talk about protest unless you are also talking about power. Mm-hmm. And this week, there is an organisation made up really of many other organisations who has been trying to do a thing called Million Acts of Hope as a counter to the far-right march that's happening this weekend. And one of the struggles of the Million Acts of Hope movement, and I don't mean this critically of them because we've been in good conversations about it, is how do you transform what we are talking about, what this hope and community means when you feel it on the street among the flags, not into an act of hope is carrying an old lady shopping or holding the door open for somebody, but an act of hope now in the face of the political threats that we have now, here and everywhere, has to be political. I don't mean party political, because where would we look for that? But properly political, with a coherent, robust political analysis that, yes, may inform your views on protest if that's what you're interested in and an expert in, but crosses over into many other areas so that you know when to turn out and who to stand up for. And I think for me now, raising my kids in this era, that is what I am concerned with. I am concerned with how do I raise children not just to be kind and carry old ladies' bags of shopping, but to understand what it is to stand up for something that is deeply political, has always been contested, and will often be a site of violence.
Martha, thank you. Roger, I'm going to turn to you, and I think a question in terms of what assembly and protest means to you probably has many different guises, but I think if drawing on your personal experience, but also where you've come to, I think in your activism over many years and where you are now, it'd be very valuable to hear that as a personal story as much as anything else.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks very much, everyone, for coming along. I was going to stand up because I like standing up, but I realised it probably disturbs the camera or something. I don't know. But yeah, can everyone hear me? Okay, I'll try and speak up. Yes, well, I maybe I should start by saying I don't know if people know, but I was convicted of causing. What did I do? I conspired to cause a public nuisance, and the British state put me in prison for 5 years, 2 years ago. And I got out in August because we won on appeal. And I think I did one public event, and then, but I've spent the last 6 months spending 60 hours a week door knocking and working in class areas of London and holding assemblies to try and work out how we can use assemblies and various other methods to animate the working class so they don't vote fascist, which we can talk about if you wish. But the upshot of it is I haven't really done many public events, so if I'm a little bit rusty and unconfident, it's because I spent a year and a half in a room with a locked door. But I'll probably warm up. Anyway, I thought I'd say that. I do have a tendency to warm up and get into proper upsetting mode. Right, okay, so I'm also not very good at answering questions, so I have got 3 points to make.
I'm good at sustaining my questioning. So.
I know, sorry. Well, I've just sat here all day sort of listening to, people go on, and I've made a few notes. So I think there's... Oh, yeah, so the other thing I was going to say was, when I was in prison, I read about this guy called Levinas. I don't know if people know this guy. And he came up with the bright idea that real communication happens when communication breaks down, which is a good excuse for saying things that are really annoying. So if you annoyed with me, it's because I read Levinas, or whatever he's called. This Jewish mystical nonsense of the 20th century. Anyway, right, so I want to say 3 things. So I think in any situation, the first criteria of sort of intellectual honesty is to contextualize what you're talking about, and in the present moment, that's utterly essential. Otherwise, you're just going to be talking nonsense, as far as I'm concerned. And the single biggest contextual point of our present moment is that we've locked in the destruction of the biosphere over the last 20 years for reasons we can discuss. Let me emphasize that has absolutely nothing to do with the neoliberal concept of climate change. It has everything to do with the death wish of the elites and various other constructions. But the upshot of it is that 4 billion people are likely to die over the next 2 generations. And I'm sure a little voice in many of your heads is going, oh my God, it's one of those climate people again. But I would humbly suggest you read Appendix 1 of the British Insurance Industries Report, and you'll find in the first paragraph the prediction that 4 billion people will die at 3 degrees C. The good news, as I'm always being pressured to give people good news, is that only 2 billion will die at 2 degrees. Sorry for my Manchester humour. But the point is, there was a book, was there not, 10 years ago that said this changes everything. So the story of the last 10 years is it didn't change anything. And now it is going to change everything. So that's just, that basically situates ourselves in a situation where, for me, most of what's happened today has a end of the regime ambience, i.e. the liberal space is about to collapse. If you hadn't noticed, it already is. And the question is, what comes next? Something radically different than the liberal paradigm or fascism, which will lead to human extinction. So there we are. That's that first strange communication. The second one is that I do not believe in human rights. I don't think humans exist. I think there is human spaces and dynamics in the human space, but there's no node to speak of. Sorry, it's a theoretical point. Also, I don't think there's rights. I think that's an invention which is historically situated in the last 200 years of liberal ideology. What I mean by that is that rights make the assumption there is a thing that can be attributed to a thing called the human. And I don't think the humans exist, so it's quite difficult to attribute things. But attributing things, for me, is part of a sort of capitalist sort of meta-logic that there's things and they acquire things. And if you're good, you get rights, and maybe those rights can be taken away. But the whole paraphernalia of human rights is highly problematic. Let's put it like that, politely. That's not to say that it doesn't obviously have some functionality, but in terms of my own reading of the literatures and the research I did at King's College for 7 years and 40 years of organising people, I think the key thing to focus on is norms and cultures, herding dynamics, when you're thinking about the human space. The human, obviously the human individual has a reality, but it's a trivial reality because it's just an embodied lump of flesh, as it were. What's really going on in human space is these dynamics. And more sort of normatively speaking, I think what's useful, the concepts here which are most useful are concepts of recognition, attention, empathy, what I would call love. Various other people have mentioned this. And these are the dynamics that animate the human space and create pro-social outcomes. And if they don't exist, then people start destroying themselves and the other, which is one of the problems with the disenchantment of the world through the technocratic orientation of liberal ideology. And there's large literatures on that, which some of you may be aware. So that leads me on to my third sort of theoretical point. Sorry to be theoretical, but which is the concept of the assembly. So there tends to be an assumption that the assembly is some sort of interesting add-on to this atomized world of human individuals. But I would argue that the actual central concept of the human space is the assembly itself. In other words, the assembly is not some quaint thing that weird people like me try and organise. It is basically what the human space is. People assemble. The meaning system is situated in the relationships between the nodes and in the culture of that space. And human health is directly dependent upon the quality of those relationships. And the assembly is, one concept which is associated with gossip, with chatting, with enacting the act of speech, and all these things lead to potential pro-social outcomes. There are various rules to ensure pro-social outcomes, which I haven't got time to talk about. So the upshot of it is you might think this is all high theory, and it is, but it does have very big implications. And as you know, some of you know, I've co-founded Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil and a whole bunch of other things. And when you're a social movement designer like I am, it's absolutely critical to understand what the human reality is, because otherwise you don't succeed because you're not using the right paradigm, if you see what I mean. And in so much as myself and my colleagues being successful, it's because we don't think about individuals, we don't think about rights, we think about dynamics and norms and interventions and prophetic speech, and these are the concepts that we use and will need to be increasingly used in so much as we're going to survive the next 20, 30 years. So I'll think I've stopped there. Did I ever?
Yeah, thanks to all of our panelists. Thank you, Roger. I'm seeing lots of through lines through all of this, and maybe that's just my optimism, but not just optimism, but I think looking for this coherence amongst what we've just discussed. What I want to move on to now, though, is I guess the attacks on assembly, and that doesn't have to be on the right. And I think, to take up Roger's point, I don't necessarily want us to get distracted by just thinking of it through the rights lens, and I think this is the time when we can't afford to be distracted to think about it through that lens. But I do want to think about what the real threats are to assembly in all its forms, including the public protest form, and what really worries you the most amongst each of you in terms of where the biggest threats are, whether that's from the state or from other actors. That's for you to tell us. But also, if you could just add something about from from the activist lens, and again, whether it's right activists or not, what are the forms of resistance that are most important to you in what you're seeing around at the moment as well? So I'm going to ask Gina this time to kick us off.
Well, I could say, I could mention many of the challenges, but I want to just focus on the chilling effects that I have been reporting from the more recent research that we did on the impact of surveillance in assemblies and associations, and I want to focus on that because it really struck me the result of the research.
Which has just been published today. I'm allowed to say that.
Yeah. It's just like the global study is just published today. The report is somewhere.
Oh, in the main.
Somewhere.
The global study's been reported.
But the global study's been published. And then it struck me because everybody talks about chilling effects, but then it is very difficult to grasp what is this. It is very difficult to prove that it exists. It is very difficult to actually see how many impacts it has, not only in the right of assembly, but also in the foundation of the collective bonds that we have as being part of society and communities. And therefore, I keep thinking about the results of this research in how this affects the way in which people consider themselves as part of a community or not, or how it is impacting, for example, as it was mentioned before, the mental health of individuals, not only activists, not only civil society representatives, not only human rights defenders, but just the regular people, as the people that Agnès met in Minnesota, and how that affects the actual possibility to think in creating a human bond with other person, to actually talk, but then also to act, but then also to celebrate, and all those other issues that happens in the context of assembly as an association. So that is something that is still in my mind, because I keep repeating, and I don't know if this is because I am a positive person, I keep repeating that people will keep assemble and associate, because that is part of our humanity. But then that when I look at the results of this research, I think, okay, perhaps this is going to affect deeply the way in which people actually trust each other and create those bonds and
Can I just clarify, when you, just for others as well, when you're talking about surveillance here, we're talking about mostly surveillance technologies, new technologies, facial recognition, algorithmic policing, just a lot of...
But also in the connection with like real surveillance, because that is it can be separated.
Right. Okay.
It's at the end, it's an ecosystem of surveillance that is rooted by what Pete was mentioning, the digital ecosystem, but also there is also it's always police, it's always people like infiltrating assemblies, but it's also other people like doing the policing. So this is just problematic. And then just very, very, very small on which is the how is the people responding. I have gotten the most hope with the young people in the recent years. Just seeing like sitting with students in the occupations in Serbia, but then also exploring the ways in which high schoolers communicate with others and protect their own assemblies, or how high schoolers are actually sometimes in the forefront of some of the assemblies in their own schools in any place in the world. And then also the pro-Palestine students that have been carrying the flag of the solidarity and the just the fight against genocide and so on. That is something that fills me with a lot of hope, because then students are also very creative and then have different ways of communicating, and then also to connecting with other generations to actually sustain their own movements. And this is something that keeps me and then that is where I think there is a lot of resistance and it's still there happening.
Great. I'm going to maybe just jump around and ask Martha if you want to come in now, and then on this. But what are you seeing as biggest threat? And
yes, I mean, I agree with everything that Gina said about the threats, and I think probably everyone in this room will be able to list off some.
Yes.
I suppose going a little either deeper or more high level, not sure which it is. I'm not sure people see it as this, but I think it probably should be seen as part of a crisis of the law itself. I think, the law, this is what I'm thinking a lot about at the moment, but the law has performed a kind of extraordinary sleight of hand in some ways. For a long time, the law rested on ideas of the common good that were drawn from God or gods, or some belief that monarchs or emperors or the state were a good thing, and therefore the law could be premised on enforcing and continuing sustaining that thing. Those things have all been toppled in various ways, and what we now have is the law being justified on the basis of itself, the rule of law. That's what liberal democracies believe in. That's kind of our religion. We like to think that the law is about challenging power. At least that's why I became a human rights lawyer, because I was like, oh, great, this is the answer. But I think for lawyers, for academics, what you realise is that that's actually a terrible category error. And the law's not about restraining power. The law's about restraining freedom. Sometimes an intended or unintended consequence of that might be that it restrains the freedom of a president or a police officer. But when it's operating, it's not operating through the lens of power. It's operating only through the lens of freedom. And so, and it's operating on the basis of a collective good that I don't think we really know how to define anymore. And so when it comes to the threats that have been listed about legislating against protest, surveilling protesters, using facial recognition technology, I think it is on a shaky foundation of the collective good being either undefined or ill-defined, or now a claim being made to define it on the far right, that then has an extraordinary architecture of legal power at its disposal. And so that legal power means that we can now expect compliance with the law, obedience to the law, at levels that when the law was invented 4,000 years ago, nobody ever dreamt of. And so I think, like I say, whether it's deep or high, I think what I worry about is how do you how do you think about rights? And I accept that that's a difficult concept in itself, but how do you think about rights and the collective good in a situation where the law is increasingly used in a way that we don't recognise to be for the collective good? And that certainly in this country, you know, reform's explicit intention politically is to establish a disciplined majority in both houses of parliament, whereupon they will be able to pass whatever laws they want to pass, as well as, of course, relying on many of the laws that already exist that allow them to do lots of terrible things. And so I think we have to reckon with what will that mean, if that's what happens in 2029 or 2034, what will that mean for our understanding of a good version of the law? How will we, as academics, lawyers, activists, interact with the law, and what's our offer in response in terms of the common good and how to bring it about collectively if it isn't through law as traditionally understood?
Roger, I might bring you in here because in some senses the UK perspective on there's the sharp immediate fear, and that's manifest this weekend potentially in one form. There's the existential fear that you've talked about already in terms of the biggest threat to the people assembled being, something that we've done to our biosphere. And I mean, grappling with all of those, and now with the work that you're doing on Assembly now, what's the biggest threat that you perceive to Assembly in the way that you would like to imagine it and see it acting in the world?
Well, as a little aside, I need to take you up on the word threat. We're not facing a threat, we're facing a certainty. Sometimes in life, certainties happen in the future. Not everything is a threat. A threat is a sort of, what I would call a sort of neoliberal privilege word, where the neoliberal system will always exist, and for eternity there will be threats. There will never be a takeover. Do you see what I mean? It's a move. And endlessly in liberal circles, no disrespect, people talk about threats. Well, it's not a threat. People are going to die en masse because we've gone over 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees is locked in. And there's 10,000 papers written on it. So don't read them if you don't believe me. So that's the first thing. The main thing I want to say is that one of the disappointing things about today was the almost complete lack of understanding of the profound paradox of what repression does to the human space. Meaning that the relationship between repression and protest / rebellion / revolution is chaotic. There's no clear relationship. And there's been 40 years of social scientific literature by people that think they can reduce social reality into linear causal systems. And when they count, the ideology says, well, we haven't got enough data yet. We've had 40 years of data on rebellions and revolutions, and no one's nearer working out a systematic causal relationship between repression and what happens to the activist revolutionary space. So there's two things to say about this. First of all, as often as not, repression creates mobilization, right? As a semi-professional mobilizer, nothing pleases me more than a bit of repression, right? Obviously, you get into trouble with all the sort of neoliberal flat analysis people and various other people that are into vulnerability sort of stuff. But, it's a long tradition, right? If you've seen the film Selma, Martin Luther King goes into a hotel, gets smashed under the face, he goes out, what does he say? Isn't this terrible? This repression is going to destroy our movement. No, he says, fucking great. He didn't use the word fucking, of course, but because, Why is he saying that? Because obviously that's the place to go. Why did they go to Selma? Because they were going to be done in, right? So this has been going on since Gandhi. It's like standard routine. I was going to use the example of Tbilisi. I mean, there's thousands of examples, But here's an example. In Tbilisi, I think in 1991, there was 1,000 people in the square. The Soviet Union was trying to maintain its control over Georgia, and everyone in the square found out that in 3 days' time, the Soviet troops were going to come down and do them in. So according to neoliberal linear causality paradigm, what should have happened, right? Everyone should have gone, oh my God, I'm going to get killed, let's all bugger off. What did happen as an empirical record is 10,000 people went into the square. Why did that happen? Well, the reasons are outside the paradigm of social science. They mainly can be understood theologically or mystically. But the point is those 10,000 people came in. It wasn't like then the Russians were going to go away. The Russians did come and kill 200 people and injured 300 people. And what did that do? Basically destroyed the Soviet Union. Like the social scientists said, that was the tipping point where basically everyone said, fuck them, we're going out in the streets as well, right? The people in the Soviet, assembly stood up and demanded a day of silence and all this sort of stuff. It was the end of the regime. That's happened thousands of times. It also happens thousands of times that the troops turn up and everyone buggers off. So, which brings me to the fundamental problem here, which is with secular rationality. That for 200 years, the dominant ideology has been that we as humans can work out what we as humans are, and we can't, right? That's the empirical record. The liberal regime has brought us to the point where we're about to die as a human species. When you viscerally engage with that reality, you either commit suicide, have a nervous breakdown, or transcend to a religious orientation. Those are going to be the options over the next 10 to 20 years. The detached liberal linear causality model is dead, or it will be dead. And this university is one of the last outposts. And I don't mean that in a rhetorical sense. I mean, just look at what Trump's done to the US, and that's before billions of people start dying. I'm sorry to keep repeating billions of people, but if you think I'm slightly mad, like, Steve Keen has just done who used to be professor of economics at UCL, so presumably knows what he's talking about, is saying billions of people are going to die because we're not going to have fertilizer next year, right? There's a whole literature on complex societies collapsing very quickly. Anyway.
Roger, can I just ask you one question there here? Because we're talking about where there's sort of resistance and the things that give you sort of some sense that actually something is happening that is worth putting some hope into, I suppose, rather than purely just the religious and the mystical at the individual level. But if it's so hard to understand the relationship between the things that we might do and the possibilities that they might create, how do we wrestle with that? Is it just you just go for it and see what happens, and if it fails, you try something different? How do you translate that big reflection on the fact that these relationships are very hard to just get into a neat causal logic with your everyday activism and what you would like to believe it has some hope in what you're doing tomorrow?
Well, the profound and outrageous thing I'm basically saying is knowledge is irrelevant to the human condition. And that's what most traditional cultures believe. Most traditional cultures are not interested in knowledge. What they're interested in doing is enacting the traditions within which they're embedded.
How do you translate that into your resistance work?
Well, I've had a conversation with Paul Engler, who's, some of you may know, is probably the best social movement designer in the Western world. He's done lots of things in the States. We're soul brothers. We had a chat. We both agree the biggest determinant of social movement growth, and you could say by proxy radical social change, is prophetic witness. Prophetic witness has nothing to do with instrumentalism. You're called by God, basically go out and get shot. And that's what animates the social space. It's nothing to do with, if I go out and get shot, maybe we'll improve things a little bit. It's about your relationship with God and various other, languages that are excommunicated from the secular space.
So I'm going to pause with you here, because it was interesting. That sort of reflects something that Tabitha said right at the beginning of today, which was this weird disconnect between the sort of secular individual right sort of claiming space that is a bit more protected in one place, but where the actual evacuation of social solidarities and associational assembly, also persists. And she used the US as the example. She contrasted that with Iran, where the sort of right is, perilously undermined, but the state of assembling is something that persists because of, one could argue, the social bonds and the ways of relating that are still sustained, the empathy, the love that you've all mentioned, as well as potentially also the religious calling as well, right? So there's something going on there. I want to bring in Agnès, because in a way, this is the non-secular argument, right? It's more the mystical, spiritual argument about how there might be still hope in assembly, and how the secular dream of a kind of rights-based order that, advances social justice is sort of a real problematic dream. How would you come in here in terms of the threats that exercise you the most, but also where you see what the forms of resistance to those threats, the strongest form they take? And I know that you have just got off a plane a couple of days ago from Australia, and as someone who's Australian does make this trip, I can see it in your eyes. so
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think we've already mentioned quite a number of threats. Violence is an evident one, and the one that we focus heavily at Amnesty International, and the multiplication of lethal use of force in and among protests around the world. It's a global phenomenon. That's something that is of concern. It has a high cost. That being said, I will say, as I have said earlier, that the biggest threat is not just directed at assembly or protest. The biggest threat is that we are living an historical moment of run and driven by predators who sole intention is to control, to dominate, and to do that through the use of the most extraordinary force at their disposal, whether it's economic or military, without any regard whatsoever for the implication for human lives. It's clear in Gaza, it's clear in fact, in the Middle East, it's clear in Iran, on all sides in Iran, including from the regime. It's clear in the United States when it comes to refugees and migrants. It's clear everywhere that human lives is becoming extremely cheap through and as part of the construction of that predatory world order. So to me, that is the greatest threat that we are confronting. The fact that there are several predators in this world right now, and that they are met by cowards. So the second threat is not the predators or the cowards. Cowards everywhere, in Europe in particular, with every European government acting in the most cowardly fashion, with the possible exception of Spain. But it's, cowards everywhere you look. It's either the elected or non-elected leaders of this world are either trying to copycat the predators, trying to look for cover, or acting in the most cowardly way. That, to me, are the greatest threat that we are confronting. As a result, assembly and protest become extraordinarily important, because in an era and in a world where the elite is failing the people in the most incredible way, the people got to act. So I'm not sure I fully understood what you were saying, because I think historically it is very clear to me. I think you may have said it too, but repression does, it's very clear what repression does. It causes people to revolt. It causes people to rise. It goes, the notion that people are going to be depressed and are not going to do anything because of repression has actually very little bearing in historical reality. At some point, either by desperation, out of desperation or out of anger, people rise. That is what history tells us, and that is what will happen. And that is what is going to feed also another circle of violence. We talked earlier about civil disobedience, violence, and so on. In my experience for the last 2 years, what I do see are people, young people in particular, going through a more and more radical route. Why? Because the non-violent routes are becoming completely blocked or are being useless. And I think the government must know that that's what they are doing. They're pushing people towards more radical forms of action. That to me is written. This is what repression does, and that is what repression will do. For an organization like Amnesty International, what does it mean? It means trying to find ways of mobilizing and organizing that are meaningful and impactful, but non-violent. Because frankly, historically as well, what we are being told is that usually, with a few exceptions, violent social movement, the use of violence is often is not going to deliver what we want. So that also is it's not a general rule, by the way, but it is certainly one of the historical things. So in any case, Amnesty International is a human rights organization, and what we want to be able to do is to find forms of activism, people's power, ways of acting in the street, outside the street, in the locality, in the capital, and so on, that make people feel that they can exercise power and influence, and that they don't need to get a gun to do that.
I'm going to leave it to the panel. I'm going to ask each of you to respond to anything that you want to respond to, but then also give us your manifesto or call to arms as such. And we are, I'm conscious of time, so the manifesto will have to be a brief version of. I'll invite whoever would like to go first, so long as they don't take away from the time of others. So who would like to go first?
I can take a shot.
Go.
Just about the last question. Of course, we collaborate, even if we don't agree. So, for example, for me as a special rapporteur, I can't do my work if I don't have the civil society and other actors just to fill me with information and just to do questions and even just to challenge the work I do. And I think that is always very important. And that is also, this is why this type of assemblies are important, because at the end we hear from each other. And even if the work that I do seems useless in some moments, at the end what we do, what at least I try to do, is just to bring up all that information, all that local knowledge, all that alerts, and just to try to bring them up front on the possibilities that I have in the position that I have right now, which is very problematic. We know everybody knows in which deep crisis the UN is, and this is still important precisely for the voice that it gives, especially to the victims. And my manifesto is very simple, and I think that we need to make everybody to understand that when the rights of assembly and association are taken from us, they are taken part of our humanity. Because then at the end, I agree with you. I mean, this, the right of assembly and association were codified as rights, but that is actually human actions. And then at the end, if we let them take parts of our humanity, then the end is a lot closer than the 50 years that you two are mentioning.
Thank you, Gina. Who would like to? Martha, go on.
Okay.
You're looking at me.
It was all a bit British, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So I agree. I think there is good collective work, and actually some of the best work is when people who share values but don't agree on the tactics and the strategies come together to try and that's sort of, I think, probably standard for anyone who's ever done any activism. And actually, I think it can be corrosive to assume that a coalition should be like mother's milk. You know, it's hard. It should be hard. Building bridges across difference is hard. That's the work. In terms of my manifesto, insofar as I have one, which I don't really, but, you know, I think at its most simple, and it sounds so glib, but it really is important given what has been said, which is keep assembling. There is a reason for it being a locus of alternative power. It is a place where you can create power, and it's important because power matters, whether it's in your local area to save your library or whether it's, you know, trying to stop the fascists or whatever. But it's also important because it's a muscle and you have to flex it, and you have to start flexing it now because there's going to come a time when we need to be really, really fucking muscular. And I think kind of related to that, I mentioned earlier the need for a proper political analysis. You know, I could bore you for hours about the number of times that I have tried to work with the women's movement on reproductive rights and people who are working on protest, and we have had these blockages because people are asking fundamentally different things of the human rights framework. Is it a system where we ask the police and prisons to help us, or is it not? And these differences have to be ironed out. You can't both have a carceral view of human rights and believe that the state is a problem and that we have to overthrow it. You know, I, as you can probably tell, tend towards the latter camp, but the mixed messaging that means and the fracturing in terms of how you can proceed is really problematic. So think about, you may not be a police abolitionist, but you may understand the critique of police violence, and so think about how your tactics may at least not get in the way of more radical ones, even if they don't directly advance them, and use that as the test for what you're doing. And then I think, you know, to end with what is really almost a cliche, but to think about the master's tools analogy, you know, Audre Lorde's kind of famous and enduring statement, I think it's fair, and look, I'm a lawyer, like I litigate, obviously I think the master's tools can do something, but see them for what they are and use them insofar as they are useful, but then open your mind to what actually it will take to dismantle the house.
Thank you. That's great. I'm going to turn to Roger because you're looking at me. Agnès is not. So there you go.
Oh, it's like going on. Yeah, so the question was, hey, we're all going to die, what do we need to do? So so the main response to that is that's exactly why we're going to die, because we're asking what we need to do. Like, because our culture is so saturated in an instrumentalist orientation, we've lost the sort of perennial philosophy that the reason you're alive is to be a good person, not to do good things. And people, you know, you're looking at me blankly because our culture doesn't understand what that means, even though most other cultures are really clear about it. The reason you're alive is to serve God and live as a good person, right? That's what 80% of the world thinks. You know, 80% of the world is religious. Dare I say, you're the outliers in so much as you're not religious, which I presume most of you aren't. And 99% of the human race is religious. And the reason for that is because people traditionally don't actually have an instrumentalist orientation, because they're not so arrogant to think that their actions are going to change the world. And, you know, there's downsides to that as well. But the upshot of it is that the first thing is to get the right question, which is, I'm 60, I'll be dead in 20 years. How do I want to spend the next 20 years of my life? in order to have some self-respect and feel like I've moved close to God, or whatever phrase you want to use. And there's a book by Ian McGilchrist that maybe one or two of you know, called The Matter with Things, which is 1,500 words long, and it's been called the best book of the century. But one of the reasons why it's a really good book is because it's basically a source book on making the point of 2,000 years of mystics and intellectuals and leaders, basically saying you have to use the right brain first before you go to the left brain. You need to know why you exist and what you want to do in your life before you can go out and start instrumentalizing. And if you don't, then you're fucked, because you'll just burn out, or you'll turn violent, or you'll commit suicide. Like, all those things are basically functions of instrumentalist pathology. Like, it's not working, oh, we must turn violent. Oh, it's not working, so I'll burn out. Or, oh, it's not working, so I'll kill myself. Like, you're not on this planet. Your life does not. Your life is not here in order to do things. You don't exist to do things. You exist in order to be something, which is human, and that's what most people think most of the time. So, having said that, once you've gone through your little stage of working out that you're just here to be a good person, obviously you have to work out which direction to go to the shops. Instrumentalism is intrinsic to life, and my day job, 10 hours a day for the last 10 years, is how to be most effective. But the reason I'm burnt out is because I've got the virtue ethics thing. I don't actually care whether I'm successful or not. In fact, every time I go to prison, like, the reason I go to prison is because I don't actually care that I'm going to prison. You see what I mean? That's why I go to prison lots, because it doesn't really bother me. And this is it. So, in terms of the instrumental strategy, I think, obviously you could say loads of things, but I think across the Western world, the biggest structural dynamic is the desertion of the working class to fascism, and that's what's going to kill us. And there's a number of reasons for that, but it's broadly because the middle class has retreated into performative university-based radicalism, no disrespect. And this has happened several times over the last 2,000 years, so it's nothing unusual. I mean, Jesus was giving the Pharisees a hard time in 33 AD, right, for the same reason, which is you're just talking bollocks and you don't get out and do anything. So the upshot of it is every revolutionary movement basically gets initiated when people leave the universities and go and talk to the working class, which is why I spent the last 6 months, talking to working class people who are great. And I, just for the record, I spent 20 years being a manual worker, so I do sort of have some experience. But the upshot of it is unless we can put together a social coalition, which includes the radical middle class and the working class, like in the 20th century, the left is fucked, because the fascists will come up along and pick us off. And, in 10 years' time, you'll be getting dragged out of the university and you'll be going, hang on, I'm supposed to be an important person, but no one's going to support you because you didn't support the working class. You see what I mean? So, it's a self-interest thing at the end of the day. And it's tough and it's hard work, and they don't like you, and you have to give them lots of love and all the rest of it. And that brings me on to the final point, which is the key determinant of mobilisation is the assembly format, for the reasons various people have said, and I think we all largely agree, which is why we're here today. Which is, it's the dynamics of the assembly, it's the dynamics within the human space which creates courage and collectivity. It's not about realising you have an individual right to do X, Y, and Z. That's not how human psychology works, for better or worse. That's what I've got to say.
Thank you, Roger. And yes, you have the very last word. It might be a bit brief.
1 minute?
That's
enough.
Your manifesto.
Well, look, for Amnesty right now, the key focus is how do we convince people who are attracted by easy fascist, to use the term, solution to complex problem. How do we bring them back from, or at least how do we convince them that this is not the way to go, and that there are better options and better solutions in, a task that is made far more difficult by the fact that right now, frankly, political parties are failing everyone, and there is very little alternative being put forward that are attractive enough. But putting that aside, that is what we are focusing on. We have a resistance strategy, which is not just to engage with ourselves and our bubble, but to also try to find messages, communication, arguments that will convince a few more people that the anti-rights agenda, that the anti-universality agenda is eventually going to destroy them, not just the brown person around the corner. And that is what we're trying to really do, find something that can be convincing enough, moving away from just talking to ourselves, and bringing a bigger tent, creating a bigger tent. So that is the key objective, without, however, losing our base. You know, the people that we don't want to lose them by becoming too middle ground. We need to keep being the radical voice that I think we are. So it's finding a way of navigating that route, which is there are very loyal supporters and people who truly believe in a radical agenda around rights, and these are our people. We need to keep them, we need to keep working with them, but we also got to find those lost soul that needs to be brought back. And I have to say, I actually not convinced that it is the working class that are going to the fascist. At least in my country, it's the rural areas. And yes, there may be working class in the rural areas, but these are not where the extreme right has been so successful. At least in France, the last 10 years, they have focused on rural areas, and they have been extraordinarily successful in capturing the rural soul, which is, you know, a bigger program than for Amnesty, but it is about we need to reinvest spaces that have been taken over by the anti-right, right-wing, extreme right-wing actors. That can be the rural area, it can be the, you know, working class neighborhood. I don't know exactly where they are, depending on where you live, but to me that is what we need to do. We need to get out of our space and work in other spaces.
Thank you, Agnès. And so I'm going to bring this panel to a close. I mean, there are lots of different thoughts, and I have lots of different questions, but we have gone over time, so I want to bring it to a close. I want you all to join me in extending a very warm thanks to our panel. And before you do that, I mean, I think this is really tough stuff. And I think one of the things from today, but especially from this panel, is there are very different analyses of the problems, and there are very different prognoses for where we're heading and where to find the green shoots, etc. But I mean, I think it is telling that amidst all of this, the idea that the idea of the assembly and the idea of assembling and the practice of it and the sense of it, the feel of what that is and how important it has been and must be to what we do next is central. And I think what we've tried to do today and try to do, I think, in the handbook is to capture that bigger thing that is the importance of assembly. And I do invite you, obviously, to have a look at the handbook, which is eye-wateringly expensive, but we can reduce the eye-wateringness just to one eye thanks to OUP's discount rates. But more importantly, I mean, if you do want to engage with the content, talk to us. We think it's already outdated, and that's probably a good thing. I mean, I say that facetiously, it's not, but in some senses this agenda moves, and it's very important that it does move. So hopefully this has been some part of it. So thank you so much, and please join me in thanking our wonderful panel.